everyone. My name is Chris Hayes. I'm the Washington editor of The Nation magazine, and want to thank the Brecht Forum for hosting us, and for the panelists for agreeing to come up and do this, and for all of you, most importantly, for coming tonight. Kind of a crazy few weeks, yeah? You know, you were just talking about the Dow falling today. This has been one of my pet peeves in the coverage, is this, this desire by the press to constantly chalk up some event to the reason the Dow fell, you know? Like, so I was thinking, you know, tomorrow maybe there'll be a headline that say, you know, on the evening there was a Brecht Forum event about the financial crisis. The Dow dropped 7%, fears of investors of imminent socialist overthrow or something like that. So we're going to go through, I'm going to introduce each speaker individually. They'll give a 5-minute sort of opening spiel, and then we'll throw it open to questions. And I guess just to clarify what, you know, we've been sort of thinking about what are the kind of things that all of us can take out of an event like this. And I think there's essentially two questions a lot of us have been having. There's a lot of technical questions, which I don't think we're going to be able to sort of get to or resolve tonight. You know, what's a credit default swap, and how does it work, and who's selling them, and et cetera. But the two, I think, political questions in terms of political economy and our own politics is, one is, how do we fit what is happening now and what has happened into our political understanding, into our power analysis, into understanding, you know, what has led us to the moment we're in politically. And then I think the question going forward that is of tremendous, tremendous importance and immediacy is the old organizer question, which is, what are our demands, right? What do we want, right? Because Hank Paulson and Ben Bernanke came to the Hill, and I was there, and it was clear what they wanted. It's clear what Morgan Stanley wanted. It's clear what a lot of people want out of what's going on now. And one question I think that all of us are trying to kind of parse through is, what do we want? What do we want to happen? So I will start to my left with Bill Grieder, who is, I'm honored to be a colleague of, and a political journalist, author, reporter for more than 35 years. He's the national affairs correspondent at our magazine, The Nation. He was at the Rolling Stone, and he is a former assistant managing editor of the Washington Post. He also wrote a book which everyone should read, called Secrets of the Temple, which is a history of the Federal Reserve, which is really kind of a Rosetta Stone in some senses for what is going on. So I would urge you all to, you know, go to your local independent bookstore or go online and purchase that. And Bill Grieder.
Thank you. Wore my banker suit tonight because I always wear it when I come to New York to interview financiers and authorities and publishers and so forth. I've been standing on a street corner with a big placard for 25 years, like those bag ladies we all know, and the placard says, "The end is nigh." Repent. And it was cold and lonely out there for a number of years, writing about the disorders of the Federal Reserve and monetary policy and the financial system and the economy and globalization and so forth and so on. I did have a premonition that a reckoning was ahead, and I will plug briefly a book that's not in the stores yet, but you can pre-order it, called Come Home America, The Rise and Fall and Redeeming Promise of Our Country. And I wrote it in the expectation that if not now, 6 months, a year, whenever, these forces bearing down on our country were going to reach a point where they had to be recognized because they were rolling us up one way or another. In that spirit, I'm not gloating. I'm feeling kind of sad for the country, frankly, because there were a lot of us in different ways trying to explain in our quiet little voices that this system was destabilized and headed for something awful. And as we all know, the communications in America don't want to hear that until the blood is in the streets. And so that's where we are. I ran into a political friend of many years at the dry cleaners in Northwest DC last week. I'm not going to name him, but he he was in a pretty good mood considering the trauma he'd been through. And he said, you know, people are asking me where I have my money after Lehman Brothers went down. And I say, the Bank of Sealy Posturepedic. So he was lighthearted about it. What excites me, and I hope excites all of you, is that we're in a very rare moment of history where a dynamic has taken hold that changes everything, that breaks all of the ideological barriers and practical political barriers, and is a serious crisis for the nation, if not, and also the world. But it's also a liberating moment, and I see that. You can see it for yourselves just watching the newspapers every day. What was it, 10 days ago, 2 weeks ago, when Brother Paulson put on the table his very arrogant proposal to bail out his colleagues in the Wall Street Club, and perhaps a few others, and literally said, you know, take it or leave it, this is what we need to stop this crisis. And Congress sort of choked a little bit, but basically caved, particularly the Democratic Party, I would say, without questioning for a moment whether it made any sense or whether it would work or what the equities were. And they passed it on a Friday, and on Monday, the stock markets of the world just blew it away. And it was an extraordinary thing to see, because all of the editorials and the hand-wringing invested in Paulson's genius suddenly just disappeared. And that process has happened through the week, as you know. And I'm reminded of a thing Art Buchwald wrote years ago about flying to the West Coast from Washington with his wife. And every once in a while, she would ask, where are we now? And he would say, I don't know where we are now. He looked out the window, there are clouds. And she kept asking that, and finally he started telling her, we're over western Nebraska, and the Rockies are just ahead, and stuff like that. I feel very much like that. People are asking me, okay, where are we now? How the hell do I know where we are? Right? We ain't hit bottom, but and it's terrible, and I've heard from more than a couple of people who really literally are losing their retirement savings, and their lives are gonna change very, very dramatically. But our perception should be, this is a rare opening. The old order is crumbling. It is fighting, the politics right now is the fight of the old order, represented not just by Wall Street, but by other interests, to cling to their diminishing power. And up to now, they have been assisted and supported in that by both political parties and most responsibles, so-called. But that too is changing rapidly. That's the dynamic we're in. So you have to now put aside the reflexive despair that people on the left usually experience, even about the election outcome and our new president, whom I think we all hope is the same person, and look at it as a dynamic process that we can influence, and as Chris said, putting big ideas, I mean fundamental reconceptions of American society and economy on the table as loudly as possible, and speak with a confidence that you're being rolled up now, but wait until next February, wait until next summer. You're gonna, there's a beginning of a consciousness in at least some of the politicians that they're in that situation. They don't know what to do about it, but they're sort of stumbling around trying to get Act Two together. And what I'm saying is, this is the moment when we talk about the society we want to help create in the most ambitious terms. And I'm not being a pie-eyed optimist. I understand all the reasons why that may well fail, but this is a moment of history people rarely get, and we've got it, and we should try to make the most of it.
Quickly to Bill's left is Francis Fox Piven, who wrote Breaking the American Social Compact and a really phenomenal book called Why Americans Still Don't Vote, which, again, I think would be a really timely read in this season. Fran.
Thank you, Chris. Well, like Bill Grieder, I think that there are a lot of unknowns. There are a lot of things I don't know that we all don't know. We don't know how deep the financial crisis is. We don't know how much it will spread to what's called the real economy. We don't know whether the government interventions that presumably are designed to stabilize the financial markets or to jumpstart the financial markets will work. And we also don't know whether Wall Street is taking over government through those interventions or whether government is taking over Wall Street. We don't know whether it's merely another bailout. We've had quite a few in this sort of roller coaster ride that we've been through as a result of the financialization of the American economy. And we aren't quite clear about whether the government interventions, the bailouts, simply mean more redistribution of American wealth upward and more scapegoating of the poor for the crisis along the way, as, for example, the Community Reinvestment Act is blamed, mortgage lending to poor people is blamed for the collapse in the markets. I don't want to talk about those things. I want to talk rather about the long-standing belief on the left that economic crisis, although it's terrible, it's tragic. I mean, a lot of people get hurt, and a lot of people in the United States get hurt, and they get hurt all the way down the sort of international economic food chain in Mexico and Africa and so on. So terrible things happen as a result of this kind of economic crisis. But it also generates new political possibilities. Now, whenever we say that or remember that, we're really thinking about the Great Depression. That's our model. And it's our model because the Great Depression generated a lot of economic insecurity and real hardship. But that was combined with a virtual total discrediting of the economic ruling class, because the economy had failed, and when the economy failed, we finally got a candidate, FDR, who railed against the economic royalists in his speeches. It was just rhetoric at that stage. But we also got a Congress that hauled these people before congressional committees and machine gunned them with questions. And it had a huge impact in the political culture, I think, of the country. For a moment, a big moment actually, maybe a 10, 15, 20-year moment. People were not in the grip of the ideas of the economic ruling class. Maybe something like that will happen now. It's already the case that the press, for example, and the Congress has moved away from the sort of idiotic worship of the Delphic statements of Alan Greenspan. Remember that? It wasn't that long ago, but now they're really angry about the terms of the bailout, for example. And did you read the story about the Chicago sheriff who said he wasn't going to evict anybody who defaulted on their mortgages? That's what happens in this kind of crisis, because who's right, who's wrong, the way the world is, everything is up for grabs. One more minute. Okay. So when the reigning ideas are questioned like this, deep economic reform becomes possible. And I want to say, I only have a minute, how specifically that happens. It's not just by us prattling up here. The other one?
I got this one.
Okay. So how do moments of economic crisis create the possibility of reform? How specifically? Well, there is an election coming up, just a few weeks. In the Great Depression, people had to wait 3 years for an election. Barack Obama, is bringing out lots of new voters, young voters, minority voters. It's also the case that they'll try to steal the election on a huge scale, The kind of vote suppression, voter caging, voter challenges, the destruction really of voter registrations and ballots is going to be unbelievable. But maybe, because the Barack team is pretty smart and shrewd about this sort of thing, just maybe he'll pull it off. But if he pulls it off, if we have a new president on January 1, that I think has got to be only the beginning of a period of transformation, not the end. In the New Deal, if that's our model, it wasn't FDR winning in 1932 that led to significant economic, social, and political change in the country. It was that FDR and his rhetoric designed to win elections, gave people a sense that they mattered, that they had influence, that they had hope. He created a climate which helped to encourage the great social movements of the 1930s, from the movement of the unemployed, to the farmers' movements, to the movement of the aged, and especially, of course, to the labor movement. Those movements, they created a lot of social disorder, but they also created a lot of instability in the electoral system. And because they did, FDR responded to the demands of the movement. Now, what should we talk about? Bill Grieder said we should talk big. We should think big. We should think about how to reorganize the economy. We should think about the end of empire, perhaps. And I think we should think about those things. But I don't think we should overlook the more homely reforms that people will respond to. Reforms like restoring unions in the United States, restoring the social welfare system in the United States, reversing the cutbacks, restructuring those programs. We don't want a national health system that gives everything to the providers. We want to rein in the providers in our national health care system. We want good income support systems, a decent retirement system, and we want to regulate the unregulated economy. In other words, if we really are in the middle of a new period of possibility, we should also be willing not only to think big, but to take it one step at a time, building the institutional arrangements that empower ordinary Americans and stand as walls, as levees, restraining the next episode of market plunder if it comes.
Great. Books include Wall Street, which again is sort of a perfect book to read. I was just thumbing through it the other day for this moment we're in. And After the New Economy, and he's working on a study of the current American ruling class, and he's a contributing editor to our fine magazine, The Nation. Doug.
Oh, thank you, Chris. And I just remembered that I first made your acquaintance in print reading a piece you wrote about the use of debt as an organizing. The possible organizing potential of organizing around debt. I think that you wrote that in these times some years ago, and I was very impressed with that idea. And it has new currency right now, so let's maybe revive that idea. Is the end nigh? I don't know. I just want to remind us that we've been here many times before, and securities fraud and financial panics are as American as apple pie, so I don't know just how different the present moment is from these many that have happened in the past. But I do want to talk about how we got to this particular moment and how we might get out of here and what it all means. A long-term issue is the tremendous polarization of incomes that's gone on in the last 30 years or so, which means that lower and middle-class people have to borrow to maintain the semblance of a middle-class standard of living. But then the rich also have plenty of spare money that they need to invest profitably, and lending it to those below them on the income ladder is a great, has been at least, a great outlet until so many of them started defaulting. But that is one of the long-term issues behind the present crisis we're in. But the proximate cause, as they say in law, is that we had a housing bubble. And as is always the case with bubbles, you can't have a good bubble without easy credit and lots of it. So the bust really now has two dimensions. The effects on household finances, people owe money on houses that are falling in value. And on the other side, the financial system is holding an awful lot of loans that are now sour. So we've got two sides to that problem, which are combining to produce a gigantic crisis. But, and this is important, it's not just a matter of simple loans on the financial side. There's a big change. Banks no longer hold loans to maturity. They package them, securitize them, sell them to institutional investors, so they get distributed all over the place. And not only that, but the finest minds on Wall Street took those loans and sliced them and diced them and assembled them into lovely gratins of all kinds baked into single dishes. Some of them layers are very fine loans, some of the layers are middle quality loans, and some of them are really sour loans. And the problem is that nobody knows what mix is in which dishes, and so everyone is very, very afraid. This has resulted in that the credit system has largely frozen up. Banks, nobody wants to do business with banks because they're afraid they won't see the money again. So the interbank lending market has virtually ceased to exist. Now, this is, may sound abstract, but it actually is very, very important. Now, financial markets sometimes dance to their own tune. The stock market is especially, has an especially tangential relationship with reality. But the credit markets are very, very important to the real world. And let me just list a couple of ways that's true. First of all, households. Consumers, households borrow a lot. Even in better times, they would be borrowing to pay for cars, credit cards, mortgages to buy houses. I was actually shocked to discover today that the mortgage volume was over $1 trillion during 2005, the peak of the housing bubble. In the second quarter of this year, it's down to $80 billion at its annual rate. Wow. That's a decline of 95% in mortgage lending. So something very, very dramatic has happened in that market. Businesses also need to borrow, not just recklessly, but also just to finance day-to-day activity. Retailers need to buy inventory. Manufacturers need to buy raw materials. Large companies borrow in the commercial paper market, unsecured short-term debt. That market is completely frozen up, and that is shrinking very rapidly. And even longer-term bank, commercial, and industrial lending which had picked up some of the slack when the commercial paper market imploded, that is now also beginning to shrink. So the business lending, which is really the lifeblood of day-to-day economic activity, is really seizing up. And then finally, governments, not the federal government is borrowing very heavily and having no problem selling its bonds so far, but states like Massachusetts and California are finding it very difficult to borrow just routine short-term borrowing. Governments get, tax payments, big quarterly tax payments, big annual tax payments, and they have to borrow to tide them over between those large lumps of receipts. The states are having a hard time doing that borrowing now. County and city governments are having very similar problems, and we're likely to see the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history very soon, a county in Alabama where Birmingham is, which will, I think, be about twice the size of the Orange County bankruptcy of about 10 years ago. So this is having real-world effects, and when governments can't borrow, they have to cut services and lay people off. So this is very, very real stuff here. Now this is a credit crunch. 1 minute. This is a credit crunch. That's not about the price of credit, the interest rate, but the availability of it. So I've heard several responses to this, let me just deal with a couple of them, and since I have only a minute, I will speak very quickly. I've heard several people say it's a hoax. No, it's not. The credit freeze is not like WMDs in Iraq. It's visible in real stats that are quoted daily, weekly, or even quoted in real time on Bloomberg terminals around the world if you have $1,200 a month for your own. People say it's their problem, but it's ours too, for the reasons I just outlined. Some people say let it all fall down. I say that's not politics, that's nihilism. There's a temptation to echo what Edmund Wilson said after the 29 crash. One couldn't help but being exhilarated at the sudden unexpected collapse of that stupid gigantic fraud. But the unemployment rate hit 25% in 1933. I don't think we want to see a rerun of that, or maybe some people do, but not me. Other people have said that the bailout package is the wrong approach. What we need is debt relief, infrastructure spending, green jobs. All those things are true and very, very good, and I want to see them too. But they're very slow, very complicated, and sad to say, there's not all that much popular support for it right now. That may change, but it's not a walk in the woods getting that kind of program enacted. It's another complaint that it's all a giveaway to the bankers. Yes, that's true to some degree, but without it, we're all cooked, and we can change that maybe someday if we have a better government. The latest complaint is that it hasn't worked. It's only been in existence for a week, and they haven't spent any money yet. And these things take years to work through, so we should be a little more patient than that. But we can do it better. And let me start with the realistic ways and then ascend towards the dreamy. First of all, equity infusions. That is, the government should buy stock in the banks in return, and then rather than asset purchases. There's a study by some IMF economists that looked at scores of banking crises around the world, and they found that equity infusions, recapitalizing the banks, are a much more effective way of dealing with this than buying bad assets and trying to sell them. Now, also financing it. Yes, it's a giveaway to the bankers now, but there's plenty of money at the top of this society. The top 10% of the population has 45% of the income, the top 1% about 16%. The top 1% has about $2 trillion in income. And we don't have to take it all at once, but we can take bits of it over the course of several years. Debt relief. Now, the IMF study also showed that debt relief is an important part of any kind of getting out of any kind of financial crisis. So this is an instance in which economic efficiency and social justice coincide. So that is an important demand to make. Re-regulate the financial system. Yes, we need to do that, but it's very hard to think about exactly how to do that. The financial system is so sprawling and complicated and global and interconnected, we can't even begin to think about that. That's a project that's going to take a long time, but it has to be done so we don't have a rerun of this nonsense, 5 or 10 years down the road. And then on the equity issue, Paulson is likely to take a passive stake. Just 2 weeks ago, we weren't even talking about the government taking equity interest in banks and buying stock, injecting capital directly into the banks. Now we are, and it's likely to happen perhaps as soon as next week. We may have been nationalizing the banks the week after next, who knows. But Paulson wants this to be a passive stake, non-voting shares. Why is that? And this is where my dreaming really begins. If we're going to nationalize them, why not control them as well, and not just give them a blank check to run things as they were? Or, short of that, why not regulate them like utilities, or the way we used to regulate utilities before the preposterous experiment in utility deregulation began? We could create all kinds of, out of the wreckage, we could create all kinds of new economic development institutions, nonprofit, cooperative, locally owned, whatever. We can create institutions that provide low-cost financial services for people now who are fleeced by check-cashing services and payday lenders. So there's a lot of possibilities. We just have to start thinking about these things. We need to think about the details. These are very vague, and there needs some flesh on those bones. And finally, just a few words on the politics of the moment. People are talking about the end of neoliberalism. Maybe so, but I see a lot more continuity between neoliberalism and the 400 years of capitalism that went before it than some other people do. But that aside, there's an idea popular among the left, right, and center that neoliberalism, that means that the state got out of the economy. The state never got out of the economy. Markets are not the state of nature. They need to be established and maintained by state power. The nature of that state and what it does is what matters. The more benign functions of the state have been taken out, like supporting people, the kinds of things that Fran was talking about. But the more malignant kinds, policing functions have been expanded, and of course the bailout functions have been greatly expanded. There is an ideological opening. You can say that markets are not self-regulating, and they tend to eat themselves if left to their own devices. And with the state getting so explicitly involved in rescuing the mess that the finance brought on itself and us, there's an opportunity to push things in a better direction. But we're pretty weak right now, and I'm really not all that sure who we are. So we have to think about what kinds of demands we can make, because who are we?
So next up, the decline of American empire, which seems timely.
So I'm going to start with my conclusions first. I think it'll make it a little easier. Now, and I'm actually going to agree a good bit with Doug on most everything, except maybe about government and the markets. You know, I think, yes, they have gotten out of the markets to, they do play a role in the markets, but that is the trajectory of the last 30 years where they have been forced out of the markets, except in a supporting role in terms of funneling wealth to corporations, the crony capitalism we see that's run rampant. Now, first, we are in a severe economic crisis that requires dramatic action. It's gone from the U.S. to global. The pathogen has jumped from the financial sector to the rest of the economy. And right now, the only institutions that can do anything about it is government. So there has to be some sort of concerted action, not just by the U.S., but now globally. And our role is to make sure that whatever policies are enacted, or one role we can play is to make sure policies are democratic, transparent, and accountable. Now, this failure and the need for systemic government interventions mean that our work is largely done on an ideological level in terms of arguing for the necessity of, say, something like a Green New Deal or single-payer national health care, which are two proposals a lot of people are throwing out there. That's because it's hard to argue against it when you have this massive intervention in the economy. This crisis might also end up doing what the anti-war movement hasn't been able to do, which is to bring about an end to the Iraq War. Now, this crisis is the contradiction of 30 years of laissez-faire economics, that is neoliberalism. The monoculture economy, and that's what we have across the world, and if we think of it as a monoculture, then the pathogens spread through the system rapidly, and that's why stock markets around the world are declining, particularly the integrated ones, the industrialized countries, and then the BRIC. You actually, what's interesting is you don't see the declines in certain countries like Central or East Europe. But without a mass-based dynamic opposition with a clear vision, agenda, and strategy, the neoliberal model will just reassert itself. And it is already reasserting itself. We see the U.S. is reportedly turning to the IMF for consultation. Iceland is going hat in hand to the IMF for a loan, and what they'll get in return is a severe austerity program. The Paulson plan has, it's essentially self-regulating, which is how we got into this mess in the first place, the self-regulating aspect of the market, which is a complete failure. And also what we see, especially scary at the local and state level, like in New York State, there's all this talk about selling off assets, or at least leasing them out for 99 years, like toll roads, like lotteries. And so again, this is a hallmark of the neoliberal model, you know, where our assets are going to be sold off to corporations for a quick infusion of cash to cover some budget shortfall. So what we need is we need a polyculture economy. Without it, we'll be vulnerable to other global contagions, and without diverse economic structures, whatever regulatory frameworks are put in place will just be undermined and overturned down the road. And now there's a huge opening for left and anti-capitalists, and we can actually talk a good bit about what we're demanding, but that to me actually isn't that interesting. You know, I don't think it's that hard to come up with detailed programmatic proposals. What's much more difficult, and this is something for all of us to really think about because the left does not like to think about it, is organization and ideology. I've been in a lot of meetings and discussions in the last few weeks around organizing against the Wall Street bailout plan, and it comes up time and again. People don't want to confront the need for organization and the need to have a clear ideology, because once you do, it leads to political battles. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but without having an ideology, something to counter the neoliberal ideology, then we can't really say what we're for, we can't say who the agent of change is, we don't have anything to organize around. So I think that is really one of the biggest tasks ahead. I'll probably actually skip through a bunch of what I wrote because I think other people have covered it well. Now, like I said, if there's one reason for this economic crisis, it is a slavish devotion to free market ideology. The raising of regulation, the blind faith in self-correcting markets, the lack of oversight, and most of all, the fervent belief that government's only role is to unleash the creative spark of the entrepreneur. That's what led to the housing market mania, its crash, and the plunge into global market meltdown. Now, of course, the Bush administration has stormed into the markets like it stormed into Iraq, and with similar results. It shunned nation building in Iraq until it had descended into chaos and then enacted an ideologically based reconstruction program destined to fail. With this latest fiasco, the Treasury and Fed spent the last year assuring the public that the contagion had been quarantined, and then when the market started to melt down, haphazardly enacted half measures that deepened the crisis. Now, one of the things that's phenomenal about the last week, you can see virtually every single day a new policy proposal. On Monday, the Fed said it might buy commercial paper. The mechanics of it aren't that important. What is important is that this the Fed would essentially finance day-to-day corporate activity. Then the Treasury did an about-face on purchasing mortgage-backed securities and said that it might inject capital into the banks in return for equity stakes. In an even more dramatic proposal, a few days later, the government said it's considering guaranteeing billions of dollars in bank debt and temporarily insuring all U.S. bank deposits, as one commentator noted, insuring them to infinity, not just this $250,000 level. Then central banks weighed in with the first ever coordinated global rate cut. Then the SEC announced that it was considering putting circuit breakers on individual stocks after they fell a certain amount and banning short selling. And by the end of today, there's talk about trying to coordinate a European-wide and global bailout. Yet rather than soothing the markets, these proposals are just stoking the fears. Take the Treasury plan to inject capital into banks. The plan is actually voluntary. The banks would have to come to the Treasury, and the equity stakes would be, quote, on terms that are favorable to the institution. And so yet again, we're replicating the same type of corrupt crony capitalism that got us into this mess in the first place. Any bank requesting a capital infusion would then probably be set on by traders like piranha on a wounded cow, because that would be taken as a sign of weakness. It's already leading to a guessing game which financial firm will bite the dust next. And this proposal, which has turned into a fear and a panic, has become a self-fulfilling reality. And we may see in a matter of days Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, the last of the Wall Street titans, on this, either on the nationalization block, going into bankruptcy, or begging for some sort of rescue. Now, in terms of proposals, I think there are a lot of interesting proposals out there. But first, one thing I do want to say is that this crisis is just working its way through the regular economy, and it is going to be severe. A lot of folks here are probably familiar with Nouriel Roubini, known as Dr. Doom, because he predicted this all a couple of years ago, an economist at NYU. And his latest statement is, in the best case scenario, we're looking at a severe recession for 2 years. And of course, in the worst case, you know, people are talking about depression, though there's no real agreement what constitutes a depression. But already we see car and retail sales are plummeting, tourism is evaporating, the tech sector is slumping, chain stores are going bust by the thousands, and job losses are accelerating. And the real world pain is just beginning as state and local governments cut back on services and government jobs, which will create another cycle of decline. Pensions are likely going to be cut, and then there's the larger impact on the third world and BRIC, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. So we can talk about the solutions later, because I guess I have less time than a Wall Street bank. So I'll just leave it at it. The real key is not just demands, but organization and ideology.
Thank you, Arun. And then last up is Naomi Klein. Maybe you've heard of her. Naomi is an award-winning journalist, syndicated columnist, author of the International and New York Times bestseller, The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism, which I believe is for sale out there. The Shock Doctrine has been translated into 17. Naomi Klein. Maybe you've heard of her. Naomi is award-winning journalist, syndicated columnist, author of the International and New York Times bestseller, The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism, which I believe is for sale out there. The Shock Doctrine has been translated into 17 languages. It's like the best-selling book in, what, Denmark or Sweden or, you know, all sorts of countries. Klein's previous book, No Logo, Taking Over the Brand Bullies, was an international bestseller, translated into 28 languages, over 1 million copies in print, and I think that The Shock Doctrine, which thesis is about how bad policies are asserted during moments of crisis, is also quite apt at this moment. Naomi.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you, Chris. I'm very happy to be here. The only problem with going last is that there's very little oxygen left in the room. I also want to thank my editors at The Nation for bringing us together, particularly Katrina Vanden Heuvel and Betsy Reed. Arun, one thing Arun didn't talk about is the fact that he was the person who sent the email that led to that great protest on Wall Street a couple of weeks ago. The email that found its way all over the web and made news and Wired and Business Week before the protest even happened, and there some of the signs at that demonstration, I think, give us an indication of where we might take this. But my favorite sign was the one that, Jeremy Scahill actually took a picture of it on his phone and emailed it to me because I was in Saskatchewan at the time. And it said, "No socialism for the rich until the rest of us get some." So I don't know if Arun planned that. Like, he must have planned that I have less time than a Wall Street bank. I want to talk about, you know, as Doug said, crises are not new, and we may be in uncharted territory, but we have experienced these bursting bubbles before. And I want to talk about two recent crises, not to say that they are the same, but that they do have something to teach us. And one of them is the Asian financial crisis in 97-98, and the other is the Argentina economic meltdown, December 2001. Because I think they have different things to teach us. And I don't actually travel with a copy of the Shock Doctrine, so I just borrowed this from the front, because I have a chapter in the book about the Asian financial crisis. It's called Let It Burn. And the reason why it's called Let It Burn is because the very same banks that have been so anxious to get bailouts from US taxpayers at the time were saying that what Asia needs, this is a quote, what Asia needs is more pain. Because, of course, Citibank, Goldman, Morgan Stanley went into Asia after the crisis reached bottom and bought up the crown jewels of the Asian tiger economies. Anyway, what I wanted to read you from the book is something Alan Greenspan said at the time. He said that what he thought that was being witnessed with the Asian financial crisis was this is a quote, a very dramatic event towards a consensus of the type of market system which we have in this country being America. In other words, Greenspan thought that the crisis was a lesson being taught to the Asian tigers for daring to protect their national industry. And of course, the IMF imposed structural adjustment programs, which forced them to lower those barriers, which allowed the very Wall Street firms at the center of this crisis to go in and engage in what the New York Times Magazine at the time called the world's biggest going out of business sale. Michel Camdessus, the head of the IMF at the time, agreed. He saw the crisis as Asia being reborn into American-style free markets. He said economic models are not eternal, very sanguine. There are times when they are useful and other times when they become outdated and must be abandoned. Once again, he saw it as a lesson. And I think what's interesting about that is I've been thinking about the fact that that maybe it's time for progressives to think of themselves as a sort of people's IMF. Because if that is the way the IMF responded to that crisis, that clearly the model was broken and that the response should not just be to bail it out, but to change it into the proper model, of course, to do it extremely undemocratically, we could see this moment in similar terms, but in more democratic terms, which is to say, we now have evidence that this market model is broken. And clearly what is needed is some dramatic structural adjustment in the USA. So let's play IMF. Now, in Argentina, they did try to use the 2001 crisis to push through more structural adjustment. But the problem, and the reason why this didn't work in Argentina, was because just a few months earlier, the IMF had been holding up Argentina as the model student. And they had already privatized everything. I mean, they came up with a list of more things they should privatize, but it was just like the ports, because that was all that was left. They had privatized everything. But also, the country itself had been very much indoctrinated in the idea that they were the model student, that they had followed the rules. And so it was much harder to sell the idea that you needed more neoliberal structural adjustment. And instead what you had was a popular uprising and a revolt against, and I think this is really important in this moment, against the entire expert class, right? The slogan in the streets, I think, is a really good slogan for this moment, which was "Que se vayan todos," all of them must go. And you know, this was the period where they went through 5 presidents in 3 weeks, but it wasn't just the politicians, it was the pundits, it was the economists, it was, and that was, and because they had boasted so much about the miracle of Argentina, they found themselves really bereft of the usual tools. Now, I think the United States in this moment, you know, is experiencing something a little bit similar in the sense that there is this consensus, and Obama has turned his election campaign into a kind of referendum on Friedmanite economic policies. I mean, whether or not he's actually going to do it, you know, I think depends very much on the forces that we're talking about in this room. 1 minute. Okay. So I will leap ahead. Okay, I want to talk about some short-term structural adjustments. Okay. Kind of pressure that can be placed on Obama right now. Bob Rubin, Larry Summers have got to go, all right? This is really crucial. And we have, I mean, I'm not just trying to make a popular point here. These guys are advising Obama on a day-to-day basis. When he wants to say that he, you know, has great people surrounding him, he talks about Bob Rubin. And that fantastic piece in the New York Times yesterday, which I never thought I would read, questioning the Greenspan legacy, was very effective in pairing Rubin with Greenspan at every turn in creating the crisis we have now. So we have a real opening right now to, I think, you know, if Move On wasn't Move On, they would be using their networks to be saying that these guys should be exiled, that they broke it, and that does not give them the right to feed on the remains. Okay, so that's one. The other sort of immediate, because I think, you know, my fellow panelists have really talked about the mega issues. So I'm just going to talk short-term strategy. Is, you know, we saw the 2 political campaigns calling for, you know, actually issuing a joint statement about the bailout, much to their shame. How about pushing the political campaigns which are both running on this, on these platforms of getting the special interests and the lobbyists out of Washington, which, as we know, is complete bullshit. Get the lobbyists out of the bailout discussions. Okay, it is atrocious, and they are swarming on this right now. In terms of having a say that they should not have in who is eligible for the bailout, and also resisting a progressive change within the context of the bailout. These are the people who created the crisis we're in, and there should just be a blanket ban on lobbying with anything having to do with the bailout. So that's 1. 2, sorry, that's 2. And then, of course, we need to make the best of a bad situation, which is that they passed this terrible piece of legislation. But as Doug said, you know, there is room to be arguing for equity instead of the buying of billions of dollars of this terrible debt. By the way, they have not abandoned that strategy. They want to do both. And I think it's one of the things that's incredible that's happening now is they're handing out no-bid contracts to the very companies that created this mess. The new frontier for disaster capitalism, as you know, I've been writing about this expanding economy, going from Iraq to Hurricane Katrina and just feeding off of it, the next disaster. Well, the next frontier of disaster capitalism is capitalism, okay? It's cleaning up after capitalism. It's a $700 billion industry. And expanding. Okay, so just one last point to think big, because I'm thinking small here. We know that this crisis that has been transferred, that is being transferred from Wall Street to Washington, all of these bad debts that are now exploding in on the public books are going to be used by the right, and that includes people like Bob Rubin, to argue that whoever the next president is, they can't afford to keep their campaign promises, okay?
Yes.
Think of this as Republican insurance against an Obama presidency, okay? And everything he's saying, yes, we can, no, you can't. You can't because we've just dumped this huge crisis on your lap. And Obama's already capitulating, okay? Huge surprise, but he's already said, well, maybe I can't afford some of things like green energy and so on. We'll have to phase them in, all right? Here's a big idea. I mean, I've been calling for the nationalization of Exxon, all right? Because I think if nationalization's on the table, let's go big. Let's not just nationalize junk. Let's nationalize the biggest corporate criminals of them all, the people who have left us with the biggest crisis that we actually face, which is climate change, which is global warming. And now we're going to hear that we actually can't afford the investments to get us to address this crisis, to change course, that addressing climate change is a luxury we can no longer afford. This is the fight we have to win, and we can't nationalize them because that, I mean, how would you tell the difference between a nationalized oil company and what you have right now? So we need to internationalize them. There needs to be an international trust, and these huge profits won by the oil and gas industry have to be the money that we use to transform to a sustainable economy. I know there's a lot of legal arguments that we need to win to get from A to B, but I think that that's a big idea that I'll just throw out there. Thank you.
Yeah, you know, on the point of Bob Rubin, this is the one lesson I've learned in a year of Washington D.C. is that you can't fail out of the establishment. Like it's like life tenure, you know, like